Sunday morning, jumped out of bed, put on my best suit, got in my car and raced like a jet, all the way to you. Walked in your church with heart in my hand to ask you a question, 'cause I know that you're a Calvinist friend, yeah. Can I question your doctrine without any strife? Say yes, 'cause I need to know. Say I'll never get your blessing till the day I die. Tough luck, my friend, but the answer is no. Why you gotta be so rude? Don't you know I'm Christian too? Why you gotta be so rude? I'm gonna question you anyway. Question tulip, question you anyway. Question tulip, yeah, no matter what you say. Question tulip, ain't what it ought to be. Why you gotta be so
rude? Welcome to Sociology 101. I know some of you maybe kept keeping up with the back and forth between Dr. David Allen and Dr. James White. Not much of a back and forth, really. It's mostly just James White critiquing Dr. Allen. And I'm trying to, properly represent both sides in the perspective here simply by playing Dr. White for himself and reading from The Extent of the Atonement by Dr. Allen, so that you can see his refutation of James White. If you haven't watched the last broadcast where I read from the 3 pages that address Dr. White's argumentation out of his books, Debating Calvinism and The Potter's Freedom, you can go back and listen to that. And then you can ask yourself the question, and some people have asked this question, why won't Dr. Allen engage with Dr. White in a public kind of format or in a debate or even via social media? For the most part, Dr. Allen simply chooses not to engage, as does Dr. William Lane Craig and Michael Licona and so many others who are very notable in their field. And I've made the argument, I believe that's because of the level of disrespect that Dr. White continues to display, not on stage necessarily. I think in person he's fairly cordial, but more specifically in his Dividing Line program. Here's one such example of what I'm talking about.
To say that Dr. Allen's response to me is surface level, disjointed, incoherent, and utterly unsatisfying is to tremendously understate the case.
Okay. Hopefully I don't even have to say anything. That's pretty clear. Even if, for example, you're at home and minding your own business, watching the ball game, and doorbell rings. 2 Mormons, young men are standing at the door, and you go up and you begin to talk to them, and they make a horrible argument. It's disjointed. It's unbiblical. It is based upon shoddy research from Joseph Smith and all these other things. Do you start the conversation by saying that is the most inane, stupid, disjointed, dumb argument I've ever heard in my life? Of course not. It's not a ironic and a cordial way of addressing somebody. It may be true even, especially with regard to the Mormons at the door. They're certainly making a non-biblical and very shoddy argument from a Mormon background. Most of us would agree from the Christian perspective that Mormonism in and of itself does not hold to a very well-researched and a very well-established point of view. But in order to have a cordial and kind conversation with them, that's not the way you address them. You can't say that kind of thing to them and then expect them to come in, sit down with you, and listening to your side or give you the time of day. And that's exactly the kind of thing that Dr. White continues to do to scholars in different fields, is that he will say things like what you just heard him say, totally, completely disrespecting the scholarship and the work of Dr. Allen, not recognizing that he spent a fairly small amount of time addressing Dr. White's argumentation, but he has a volume of work backing it up that does address many of Dr. White's argumentations and points, and quoting from other Reformed theologians who amply argue against James White's perspective on the atonement. And so to try to insinuate that everything that Dr. Allen says in the 3 pages that were presented against James White fully and comprehensively covers every aspect of James White's argument, it never claimed to address all those things. But even then, Dr. White doesn't take, in my estimation, the time needed to fully engage with even what Dr. Allen actually did present. And I think that becomes pretty obvious here when we look at this. Let's take a look.
I would just invite anybody. I invite anybody, check me out, buy his book. I'll advertise Dr. Allen's book. You can get it on Kindle. Buy his book and read my chapters on particular redemption. Hopefully you'll take the time to recognize that they are a part of a larger work, and hence there's a flow to the argumentation. And then read Dr. Allen's response.
Now, notice he acknowledges within his own book there's a larger context and a flow. Well, the same is true of the extent of the atonement. There's a larger context and there's a flow. And Dr. Allen only he's addressing certain historical figures, including modern-day figures like Dr. White, who hold to respective views of the atonement. And so when you look at the different chapters and how they're all divided up and what Dr. Allen is attempting to cover in a book that's called The Extent of the Atonement, a historical and critical review, then you see that the purpose of this particular section is not to exegetically and hermeneutically answer every point that each one of these figures brings up in their books. That wasn't Dr. Allen's purpose. And therefore, why would you hold him to a standard that you wouldn't hold to yourself in what you are striving to accomplish within your own work?
And I believe that the vast majority of unbiased individuals will go, that doesn't even touch it, and now I understand why he's not debating.
That's not why he's not debating. Again, it's the same reason this is the same kind of thing that he'll say about William Lane Craig. That makes it sound like William Lane Craig's scared of Dr. White or scared of cross-examination. He does this with other people who refuse to engage with him based upon his lack of cordiality, his lack of respect, his disrespect for people in learned positions. And for some reason, he can do better when it comes to treating Muslims and other people of other faith. But when it comes to treating his own, the other believers who believe a lot more closely to him than others. I mean, traditionalists are closer to Dr. White than Dr. Michael Brown is. Explain that. And how does he think it's okay to show that level of disrespect to Dr. Allen and think that Dr. Allen's going to go, oh yeah, hey, let's get together and have a discussion. I'd like to promote James White as somebody that I want my students at Southwestern to actually listen to, and the way he engages people in his dividing line. No, that it simply is not going to happen. It's not going to continue to happen in that regard. And so I just think that the reason I keep pointing these things out is because I want our listeners and to understand this is what we don't need to do in order to have good conversations and to further the engagement, to further understand and to sharpen each other. This is the kind of disrespect that you shouldn't be showing to others, just calling their arguments disjointed and not applying a principle of charity that we talked about before, of how he continually belittles Dr. Allen and his scholarship and other traditionalists in that same way.
When we turn to Dr. Allen's book, we read the following. White discussed Romans 8:31 through 34 and Hebrews 7 through 10 as affirming limited atonement. Yet nothing in either of these passages affirms limited atonement. And then he moves on. That's it. A man who wrote a commentary on the book of Hebrews. I argue from Hebrews 7 through 10 for pages. Preached multiple sermons through Hebrews 7 through 10, before and after. And the only response we get is, yet nothing in either of these passages affirms limited atonement. That's the nya response. Or the, oh yeah? I can see why you would not want to defend that in debate, because, I was talking like a 3-hour debate, and it wouldn't take long to get past that level of response.
Okay. Wow. Do you see the level of disrespect I'm talking about? You want to talk about playground kind of behavior. First and foremost, the arguments that Dr. White holds to are held to by other historical scholars like John Owen. And Dr. Allen covers throughout his book that argument in many different pages, usually by quoting from other more moderate, lower forms of Calvinists, in order to show the relatively extreme type of view of atonement that Owen and others like Dr. White hold to. Plus, that's not all that Dr. Allen even says in the book. If you notice, when he pulled that up there, it had a footnote at the end of that statement. Now, footnotes within historical documents like this are oftentimes where you go to look for other citations and place where they're getting their information. And Dr. White doesn't even attempt to look at that footnote, footnote 126. Matter of fact, you probably saw it there if you looked there back at the book. He just read that thing, yet nothing in either of these passages affirms limited atonement. And then it has footnote 126. It was there in his Kindle version too. He just has to click on it. He can look at the further refutation. And here's 126. It says, among high Calvinists on Romans 8:32, there's a hasty term generalization. They convert the us into the general term all, and in the sense of all, the elect irrespective of faith, thus arguing that all for whom Christ died will be given all things. In the context, however, the us explicitly refers to the justified or the believers. The idea is that since God gave his Son for those of us who believe, how much more will he give us, who believe, all things? Paul also uses the same form of the aphorete argument in Romans 5:8-10. Now, notice that he does have other commentary here. Dr. White doesn't acknowledge that even. And moreover, as I already mentioned, Dr. Allen spends volumes of his time covering the issues from Heaven He Came and Sought Her, which has argumentation that are similar, some of it which similar to Dr. White's. Owen's argument, as we've mentioned before, is similar to Dr. White's. The commercialism that we've talked about of Owen's view is similar to Dr. White's, all of which is covered extensively, usually by quotes from lower forms of Calvinism. And that's why when we talk about high Calvinists, that's not a term unique to Dr. Allen. The high Calvinist is even Phil Johnson's recorded on the Bible-thumping wingnut as admitting that, James White has a higher form of Calvinism. Well, what's he talking about? More than likely, he's referring to his view of atonement, because Phil Johnson has, in the past at least, shown disagreement over Owen's view of the atonement and the way in which it's addressed sometimes. Now, I know they're friends, and I know it sounds like people are trying to pit one friend against another by saying certain things that Phil Johnson has said in the past about not undermining the pleading of Christ and the genuine desire of Christ that we talked about in our last episode. If you didn't listen to it, go back and listen to it. I showed the quotes for themselves. And I admit, I don't like the labels. I think that the term anti or the term semi-Pelagianism or Pelagianism, I don't like those terms because I think it tends to silence debate and tends to whitewash things. And I think the term hyper-Calvinist can do the same thing. But when Phil Johnson speaks of hyper-Calvinism in his works back in the early 2000s, he speaks of it as related to undermining the pleading or the well-meant offer or the desire of God, which it seems to be pretty clear that A.W. Pink and James White and those like that, the higher forms of Calvinists, tend to do that. They have a tendency towards hyper-Calvinism. And that's all we're saying. We're not trying to say they're anti-evangelistic. We don't believe James White's anti-evangelistic. We're saying that higher forms of Calvinists tend to use the same argument as hyper-Calvinists have, with regard to passages like 2 Peter 3:9 or 1 Timothy 2:4, trying to kind of take out the alls of the text, as Spurgeon criticizes higher Calvinists for doing, and instead say things like, well, God doesn't really love everybody in the world. That's not really what it means. He doesn't really desire everybody in the world to come. It means all the elect of the world. That's not, every form of Calvinist doesn't make that argument. And acknowledging that, there's nothing wrong with acknowledging that. I'm not trying to pit one Calvinist against another by acknowledging that. I'm just trying to say that there are different Calvinists who make different arguments. And for Allen or myself to appeal to a more moderate Calvinist like a Charles Hodge or a Shedd or a Dabney or even Armraldians in order to make a case for our perspective, we're doing so because we recognize that while a Calvinist may not listen to Leighton Flowers or Dr. David Allen, they might be willing to listen to Charles Spurgeon. They might be willing to at least heed the warnings of a Charles Hodge or a Shedd or a Dabney because they have respect for them, and they don't just think that they're going to be dismissing them outright just simply because they disagree with the other aspects of Reformed theology. And so we oftentimes may refer to other historical theologians who held to similar views as the Calvinist holds to, but who at least acknowledged a universal sufficiency, actual sufficiency, not a hypothetical sufficiency. That's an important distinction of the atoning work of Christ, and how the commercialism actually falls short, even by other Reformed Calvinist admission. And so I hope that you see that I'm not trying to misrepresent Phil Johnson or James White, or I'm not trying to undermine their argument as for what it is. I'm just simply saying that, one, that kind of reaction or response, that's the reason Dr. Allen will not engage with Dr. White. That kind of disrespect right there that you just heard, that yeah, in the playground kind of stuff, where he's not really engaging with a principle of charity, recognizing the entire work that Dr. Allen has presented, the footnote in and of itself that refers to other argumentation within the book that he's already made, and to paint Dr. Allen in the light that he has. Well, listen to what he says here. I mean, and tell me if you are a respectable PhD at the top of your field in this study, would you want to engage this and give it any kind of credibility? Listen to what he does.
Not really. There's some really confusing stuff. Really, really, really confusing stuff elsewhere in the book. Again, this is gonna sound very. You're just being mean. Get the book. Get the book. Read it yourself. Some of it simply doesn't even make any sense. It certainly is not written to try to communicate anything to anybody.
It certainly is written not to communicate anything to anybody? Yeah, I mean, the only redeeming factor is that he actually does tell people to get the book and look for themselves. Guys, I've been reading this book. A large percentage of this book is quotes from Reformed, respected, Calvinistic leaning, if not full-fledged Calvinists, explaining the view of the atonement from their own words. I couldn't say what the percentage is, but just opening up to this page right here, there are 7 quotes on this page, 3 quotes on this page, large block quotes. It's one of the reasons it's such a long book. It's 150 pages. A lot of it are block quotes from Reformed theologians throughout history. And to dismiss the scholarship, dismiss the work of Dr. Allen that he has poured into this with the wave of a hand, and then expect him to give you the time of day? Wow. What audacity. I don't think there's anything else that needs to be said. In fact, I'm done.